Abha had asked me to speak about some of the advances in Gaucher disease, the past, present, and the future. And actually, as I begin this, I want to discuss another part of it, is that there is the whole INCAP program, or the India Charitable Access Program, which became available because of a kind sponsor called Genzyme Corporation, by which these patients now in India are getting treatment with enzyme replacement therapy. And I think that one of the advances that we're going to make is our understanding of the differences in clinical presentation and manifestations, and then the response to therapy in different parts of the world, including the Indian population. So having said this, I think all of us have heard this over and over again today. It's an inborn error of metabolism day. The other important part to remember is it's really the most common lysosomal storage disorder, even more than Tay-Sachs disease. It's autosomal recessive. The genetic defect is on chromosome 1. There is an enzyme deficiency, which I'll come to. It's a disorder of the reticular endothelial system. So once again, if you pay attention to what the RE system consists of or what it does, I think one can understand the symptoms and progression of this disease. And the other important part to remember is it's not just a splenohepatomegaly. It is a progressive multi-system, multi-organ dysfunction in this condition. And so the metabolic defect in Gaucher disease is due to the deficiency of this enzyme, glucocerebrosidase, or acid beta glucosidase, as a result of which, if you think about a block, you won't have the downstream products, and what you accumulate then is the precursor, which normally would have been broken down to, say, glucose and ceramide. And so here the material that accumulates is glucocerebroside. So when this accumulates, what really happens and where does it occur? So as was just said in the previous talk, it is really a disorder of the reticular endothelial system. And so let's think about monocytes and macrophages and where do we find them. And if we think about that, we can understand the clinical manifestations of this disease. So the spleen, the lung with alveolar macrophages, the bone with osteoclasts, the Kupffer cells of the liver, and the bone marrow. So I think just thinking about where you would find the accumulation of these macrophages or these Gaucher cells, one can really understand what the symptoms and signs of this disease would be. So having said this, this is what the Gaucher cell looks like. It's got this crumpled paper appearance and is an engorged cell now with the glucocerebroside. And the part let's think about is we always talk of these as rare inborn errors of metabolism, but let's see if we look at all the lysosomal storage disorders, amongst them Gaucher disease really is the most common, accounting for about 14% of cases. And this actually came out of a study from Hopwood's group in Australia. Now let's look at the comparative frequencies of the various inherited diseases. We talk of lysosomal storage diseases as rare, but if you look at them cumulatively, if we put all of them together, the frequency is about 1 in 7,700. And now let's look at Gaucher disease, and as was asked by Dr. Amdekar, Gaucher disease among, say, the Ashkenazi Jewish is very common. It's about 1 in 850 as compared to the non-Ashkenazi Jewish population, or the non-Jewish population, where it's about 1 in 40,000. Now let's think about cystic fibrosis, which clearly is not a good example for India, but here it's 1 in 2,500. And if we think of even hypothyroidism, which is about 1 in 3,500, so if you look at the lysosomal storage diseases in combination, they're really not that rare. We really have to think about them to start making a diagnosis. So now let's talk about type 1 Gaucher disease, and I really like to look at it as a spectrum of involvement. I just can't think of these conditions as in silos because they all correlate and they all go into a continuum of what we call of disease manifestations. So for type 1 Gaucher disease, which we've traditionally thought of as non-neuronopathic, and I'll try and speak to it in a few minutes, there is, yes, some neurological component to this disease also. If we think about now the RE system and the organ involvement, as was discussed, there's splenohepatomegaly. There is, because of the involvement of the spleen and because of the bone marrow, there can be a pancytopenia, and initially it can present as thrombocytopenia, anemia, and then because of the thrombocytopenia, there's bruising and bleeding. There clearly is fatigue because of the anemia, and also there can be delayed growth or growth retardation. Very often, because of targeting and involvement of the bone marrow, they can involve and result in significant bone pain and crises, and often there's abdominal pain. So now let's think about type 1 Gaucher disease. Here's a young child with Gaucher disease with massive splenomegaly. Here is an older patient and then a still older patient, and you can see is that the age of presentation can be very different, and they can all have the same underlying genotype. So clearly, I think when we think of single gene disorders, we cannot just say that genotype equals phenotype. There are multiple host of other factors, epigenetic markers, environmental factors, which really determine why a patient with, say, an underlying mutation or set of mutations may present very early to someone who may present much later in life, to someone who could be clearly fairly asymptomatic and have their first disease manifestations as late as the 8th decade of life. This is true amongst the Ashkenazi Jewish population, where this is well studied. Now let's look at the other extreme of this disease spectrum. It's the same enzyme deficiency, but here now we've got someone with what we call type 2 Gaucher disease, or the acute neuronopathic form. But once again, think of it as a spectrum, with this being at one end of the severity of disease. So these patients present very early in life. They've got strabismus, they've got the cortical signs, so they've got retroflexion of the neck, they've got the cortical thumbs, they've got pyramidal signs, they've got the visceromegaly, they've got a failure to thrive and cachexia, and typically these babies can die by about 2 years of age. And so even if we were to treat some of them, say with enzyme replacement therapy, we have to think about it that this is a macromolecule. ERT is a large molecule which would not cross the blood-brain barrier, and so we would not expect to cause an improvement of these drastic neurological symptoms that they have. So type 2 neuropathology is that there is also accumulation of the material in the brain, and it's primarily in the brainstem. And so once you think about that, if you have brainstem nuclei that are affected, you can think of the manifestations of the disease based once again on the pathology. Now let's think about type 3, and that's the question that I was asking in the case presentation, which we often call as chronic neuronopathic Gaucher disease. It can be severe early onset. There can be progressive developmental delay, or it could just be oculomotor apraxia and some of course, the visceral findings of the condition. And sometimes it's just restricted to eye findings in type 3 Gaucher disease. In fact, if you look at some of the older literature from, say, even the Japanese population, patients that were originally labeled as type 1 Gaucher disease were subsequently identified at a later time point to actually have neuronopathic or type 3 Gaucher disease. So the neuropathology in Gaucher disease, there are certain ethnic populations where you see more of a certain subtype. So for instance, the Israeli type is more of type 1, less likely to have type 2 or type 3. And now as we're understanding it in other areas of the world, such as the Asia-Pacific region, the Africa, Egypt, etc., they have more of neurologic Gaucher disease. And even amongst those with neurologic Gaucher disease, once again, those with the L44P homozygous mutation, there's a whole spectrum of involvement that can be seen, once again telling us the interplay of gene and environment, and in these situations, much more of gene-gene interaction. So the diagnosis really can be done, as Abha mentioned earlier, is by enzyme assay. There's really no need to do a bone marrow unless it's being worked up for a differential diagnosis of splenohepatomegaly. But if there's a strong clinical suspicion of Gaucher disease, one can clearly make the diagnosis from a leukocyte assay looking for glucocerebrosidase activity. You can also do it on cultured fibroblasts from the skin. And there could be some kind of correlation between the amount of residual enzyme activity and the severity of Gaucher disease. But once again, it's not always a good predictor of clinical severity. I think DNA analysis has a very important role, not just for confirming a diagnosis of Gaucher disease, but I also look at it really for at-risk situations and discussing what the outlook of these particular patients can be, and more importantly, really from a genetic counseling perspective, how do you really make a diagnosis because of the carrier frequency and informing other family members. So the natural history of Gaucher disease before the development of a therapy, and this is the part that Dr. Amdekar was asking me, is there is a point of what we call asymptomatic organomegaly, or where the symptoms are really minimal. And so there can be a point then here where you can change the clinical course quite dramatically as to when they enter into the stage of symptomatic organomegaly, where ultimately it would lead to a stage of tissue damage, inflammation, infarction, fibrosis, or what we say a point of no return, where despite enzyme replacement therapy or whatever the therapies are, you may not be able to reverse a certain damage that has occurred. And so the course really for these patients in the past was, when they enter the stage of symptomatic organomegaly, was to do a splenectomy, and then ultimately could result in morbidity and a premature death. And here, once again, I'll speak about the role of splenectomy and some of the downside or effects of it, because the spleen ultimately is a big storage organ. So if you remove the spleen, you've got to move these storage cells to other areas, and so the risk of pulmonary hypertension or of having a bone crisis are much more in these patients who are post-splenectomy. Of course, it can be life-saving in certain situations. Now, the cause of death in type 1 in the pre-ERT era really was bleeding. It could be liver failure, infection, crippling bone disease, pulmonary hypertension, as I alluded to, and also a higher risk of hematological malignancies. So now let's talk about the extent of involvement of these patients. So there can be pulmonary involvement in Gaucher disease, and the forms of lung disease can be anywhere from pulmonary hypertension to those with the neuronopathic form, where we see interstitial lung disease, or even lobar consolidation. So I really think about Gaucher disease honestly as a continuum of disease phenotype, and I think we need to think of most of our genetic conditions or inborn errors of metabolism as a continuum of disease spectrum and not something as working in silos. So at one end, if we think of type 1, at the other end, if we think of type 2, really there can be a complete overlap or some amount of synergy that's going on from type 1 to the other extreme of type 2. And there was a beautiful paper that had come out, showing the progression and the overlap between type 2 and type 3, and that you can't really separate these patients out as was in the old classical definitions. Now, there are other phenotypes also for Gaucher disease, and hydrops fetalis is also one of the presentations. It may be rarely seen, but when one sees this kind of situation, one can think about it also. Now, I talked about cancer and Gaucher disease, and so we have to remember that the lymphoproliferative disorders are more common in patients with Gaucher disease. They can develop a chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Multiple myeloma we clearly have seen in some of our patients with Gaucher disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, certain bone tumors, and as I mentioned earlier, multiple myeloma, and thus monitoring of these patients sometimes does become important. Now let's talk about the Gaucher genotype as we spoke about it. And can we make any broad assumptions based on the genotype? So you can see that here along the gene, there are multiple mutations right throughout the gene And so the diagnosis, often by DNA analysis, is required because, yes, there are certain common genotypes, but you cannot exclude a diagnosis if you just looked at a certain panel of mutations. And very often, whole gene sequencing is required to make a diagnosis of Gaucher disease. Now let's look at the genotype phenotype. I think broadly one can say that if one has the N370S and another Gaucher allele, the risk of having neurological involvement is very low, and so then this likely is type 1 Gaucher disease. And then if you have the presence of L44P in homozygosity, we do think that there will be some kind of neurological involvement, the extent of which can be very variable. There are, of course, other genotype-phenotype correlations, but broadly, this is to separate between neurologic and non-neurologic. Now, in terms of assessments, I think this question was asked, how would we monitor these patients? I think looking for the skeletal involvement in terms of x-rays of the femora, the spine, and other symptomatic signs, MRI of the long bones, use of the DEXA scan because we're seeing osteopenia and osteoporosis as a significant component of this disease, hematological manifestations, as was discussed earlier, in terms of the hemoglobin, the platelet counts, and of course the other enzymes like the chitotriosidase, looking at the ACE and the TRAP, or the tartrate-resistant acid phosphatase, and then looking at volumetric assessments by doing CT or MRI imaging, to get a good assessment. So 2D imaging would not give us a real assessment in terms of response to therapy. Rather, you'd need the 3D structure to really see if there is an improvement in organ volumes on enzyme replacement therapy. And then, yes, the involvement of the pulmonary system, so doing a Doppler echo of the heart, but really paying attention to right-sided pressures, looking for evidence of increased pulmonary pressure or pulmonary hypertension. So once again, as I said, the mutation analysis, and I think a growing number of the population here in India is getting the genotype done. And I think what we are seeing is a large number of patients here with the L44P mutation in homozygosity. So to tell us that neuronopathic Gaucher disease is fairly common in the Indian subpopulation. So now let's move to the next part. If we think about a diagnosis, I think that's the exciting part as I look at it as my career, is the now development of therapies, or what we say moving from diagnostics to therapeutics. And so if we think of a treatment, you've got here a substrate which normally would be acted upon by a particular enzyme, and then you would have a product. And then if you have the missing enzyme, you've got an accumulation of the substrate which may have toxic effects, and also accumulation of precursors, and then you've got the downstream effects or deficient downstream products, which may have a very important role. And this really becomes important in some of our organic acidemias and other conditions. So the treatments for Gaucher disease, I think in the past bone marrow transplant was done. It was curative. Then in the early 1990s, there was development of IV enzyme replacement therapy, getting the enzyme which was purified from placenta, from human placenta, and this was called IV ceridase. And then in 1994, Cerezyme became the standard of care for all forms of Gaucher disease, including the life-threatening forms, but really, once again, the importance of counseling and expectations of a family, that if you've got significant neurological involvement, you would not expect to have a change with treatment with an enzyme replacement therapy. Then there's also the approval of a small molecule, and I'll try and speak to this also, for those patients with Gaucher disease who cannot tolerate the IV form of the therapy. And now you can imagine in this rare disease sphere, we've got numerous companies trying to develop new enzyme therapies. So we've got another therapy called velaglucerase alpha, which is very similar to IV Cerezyme, except that it's now on a human cell line versus a Chinese hamster ovary cell line. And what we have now in development is small molecule therapy to target the resistant organs, say for instance bone, or to cross the blood-brain barrier and target the central nervous system, as well as what we call chaperone-mediated therapy. These are concepts. I'm using Gaucher disease as an example, but the idea really is that these therapies can be at different parts of the pathway to help in the development or in treatment strategies for these conditions. So I think this is more for the postgraduates to think about, that if you look at a pathway very carefully, you can really make an impact if you can find ways to replenish the missing components and to get rid of the toxic ones. And a classic example of this is tyrosinemia type 1, where you use now an insecticide and you convert the patient essentially, say, from tyrosinemia type 1 to type 2 tyrosinemia, but you prevent some of the downstream effects of succinyl acetone in terms of the malignancy. So this is the question that was asked about the response to enzyme replacement therapy. So this is a young girl who was 8 years and 8 months when she started IV enzyme replacement therapy. And this is her 2 years later. You can see a dramatic reduction in her liver and in her spleen volumes. She's also looking way taller. And so the long-term response to enzyme replacement therapy really has shown a reversal of anemia, a reversal of the bleeding tendency, a reversal of the organomegaly. It can eliminate the bone crisis in these patients. It can improve the bone density, reverse the growth failure. Splenectomy is no longer really needed in these patients, only in certain situations. It can improve the quality of life in these individuals. So it is really life-changing. Now, the impact of ERT on the natural history of Gaucher disease has changed since the advent of enzyme replacement therapy, so it gives us as academicians more to learn, more to write about, and more to understand. And there are some problems that continue to persist in the era of enzyme replacement therapy. And so this is the kind of response you see: an improvement in the platelet counts of these patients, an improvement in the hemoglobin counts of these patients, both without splenectomy and those with an intact spleen, a reduction of the spleen volume by enzyme replacement therapy. And this is just from the package insert of IV imiglucerase, which is the treatment for Gaucher disease. But I want to emphasize one more part, and I think this meeting has really brought this about beautifully, is that we really need to have a team approach when caring for these so-called single gene disorders or so-called hepatic conditions or renal conditions. And at the center of it really is the patient and the family, and then you have multiple subspecialists as needed, but really working in a team enhances the care of these individuals. And another thing for food for thought is if you think about the treatment approaches, you've got one where you can provide the missing enzyme, like it's insulin to a patient with diabetes. And then there are other approaches where you can prevent the substrate from accumulating, what we call a substrate reduction therapy. So if you have less substrate or less glucocerebroside, then you have some residual enzyme in the body which could work. So that's another strategy. Or you can do a combination where you reduce the amount of substrate with a substrate reduction and you provide the enzyme replacement therapy as a combination therapy approach to the treatment of this condition. So once again, using a team approach even in these therapies or a multifaceted or a multi-pronged approach can give you the best outcome. So having said this, this is the other concept of a chaperone therapy, and a chaperone is nothing but a helper, and this can really help in the situation of a misfolded protein, which many of these could be in our inborn errors of metabolism, because we know that the misfolded proteins are unstable. They may not meet the quality control of the endoplasmic reticulum, so the protein may never end up in the lysosome, which is the target site for its action. And so if you can help that by providing a pharmacological chaperone which goes to this misfolded protein, causes a stabilization of it as a protein chaperone complex, which then ultimately allows it to enter into the lysosome where it can do its job and then clear the substrate. So you've got the enhanced trafficking that's going on and a substrate clearance. So this is a very important concept which is now in development, not just for Gaucher disease, but for other inborn errors of metabolism, and including for conditions like Parkinsonism, etc. This concept of misfolded proteins is very important. And then, of course, gene replacement therapy is another approach. Now, some advances in our understanding, and I thought of adding these slides, is because of the discussion earlier this afternoon about Parkinsonism or neuronopathic symptoms, even in type 1 Gaucher disease. And I'm going to leave some of this as food for thought. So here you've got Gaucher disease, and here you've got Parkinson's disease. And here you have really the loss of dopaminergic neurons and the presence of Lewy bodies. And now you've got the substantia nigra and these aggregates of proteins, including alpha-synuclein. So what is the connection between the two? Because we're seeing now some patients with Gaucher disease or carriers of Gaucher disease who are developing Parkinson's disease and also the reverse. So there are rare groups of patients with both Gaucher disease and Parkinsonism. Then there are relatives of Gaucher probands who have an increased frequency of Parkinsonism. And then you can have 12%, this was a study that was done where the brain bank samples with pathologically confirmed Parkinson's disease had mutations, but no real expression or no diagnosis of Gaucher disease. And this is now being increasingly studied, and patients with other synucleinopathies also are identified with having mutations in the Gaucher gene. So this was Gaucher disease and Parkinsonism. How are these two disorders related? And here brain samples from individuals with Gaucher disease showing the presence of Lewy bodies, inclusions characteristic of Parkinson's disease and other related disorders. And one can really be homozygous for these mutations, having a higher propensity for Parkinson's disease. And this is work actually from Dr. Mistri's group also showing that there's a 20-fold increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And what could be the effects? And clearly this is work in progress. A mutation that results in protein misfolding, as I showed you earlier, could promote alpha-synuclein aggresomes in these dopaminergic neurons. But I think that this field is clearly a lot to be done. And what I really want to end with really is what I think a significant advance in the field of Gaucher disease is now, the development of enzyme or the availability of enzyme replacement therapy for Gaucher disease in India. And none other than our own Abha Nagral, who's the first author. This paper was recently published in collaboration with many physicians, some of who are here in this room, and as a joint collaboration, telling us that we can work collectively together, make a difference in the lives of our patients. And here, as Abha already pointed out, we had an improvement in hemoglobin, in platelets, in weight, in height, in overall growth, and in symptom improvement in these patients. And so I'd really like to acknowledge my multiple colleagues at Duke, my colleagues in India that have made this really feasible, my colleagues from the International Collaborative Gaucher Group, of course, to Pramod Mistry, who's a longtime friend and collaborator, and most importantly, our patients, as Dr. Amdekar said, they're the ones who really teach us. Thank you.